Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Belong Collective. Just the moment you've been waiting for. We're going to do a series starting today on politics. New series called Talking Points. Everyone's favorite. We're going to talk politics. You don't get enough of it in your life, so let's bring it to Sundays, to your weekends. You know what I mean? What's great is that some of you are actually juiced up for this series. You're like, get them, Justin. Tell them. Let's go. Others of you are like, what's he going to say? Be careful, Justin. Be careful, Justin. You're going to do something. Don't do it. And politics has this way of bringing out all kinds of reactions from different people. I don't know if you've noticed this. I mean, probably not. It's really subtle. But when we talk politics, we can tend to get angry, anxious, sad, frustrated, depressed, and any other number of emotions can come out. And when we think about why that is, it's because it's emotional. Like the impact of how we organize our communities. And just to be clear, when we talk about politics through this series, we're not talking about arguments that happen over some random thing. We're talking about how communities organize to take care of one another, how communities organize on agreed upon things. For example, today, you drove here, or were driven here in a car that was on a road, that if it were not for politics, you would not have a road. You would not have a road paved. You would not have stop signs. You would not have the sewer underneath the road that ultimately allows you to go to the restroom here in the city. Politics is how these things get done. Now, in our modern world, the unfortunate thing is that when we think of politics, we don't think of how communities organize and make decisions. But instead, what we think about is we think about arguments. We think about our side, their side. We think about all the relationships that we have that have been fractured due to differences of opinion. We don't think about how politics is serving our community, serving us, or even serving the marginalized. And so, through this series, I want us to remember that when we bring up the word politics, that's what we're talking about. The impacts of how we organize our community for our advantage or disadvantage can bring out the best or worst of us. Like it's just a reality. If you've ever waited in line at the DMV, you know this, right? You're like, who designed this place? They don't know what they're doing, right? Like when we enter into systems, like that's a political conversation. Okay, well, let's talk about that. There's a reason there's a line, because this is probably underfunded. But right now, you're probably going to be mad at the person, on the other side. But really, the thing is, this whole system, it's a structure, it's a process. What's going on with the process? When we think that way, though, we begin to have an empathy and understanding for the process. We can also be like, oh, this is messed up. And then we get to maybe corruption, we get to all kinds of conversations. But ultimately, I want us to think about organization through this whole thing. And then obviously as a church and as Jesus followers, right? When we see a community marginalized already or further marginalized, and we see that disadvantage and sometimes downright abuse being done through politics, through the way we organize, one might argue there's an ethical imperative to have an emotional response, right? So we even feel this innate feeling of it's ethical for me to be angry and frustrated with a system that removes people's humanity. Of course that would be our response. And if we identify with Jesus, it would probably even be a deeper sense of our response would be to be frustrated by people being marginalized. Now, a few rules here before we get started. It is okay to be emotional about something said in this series. You got my permission. Not that you need it, but I'll give you permission to be frustrated with me. You have permission every Sunday to be frustrated with me, just so you know. Go ahead and take that permission every single week. But I'm just saying through this particular series, you certainly have that. Furthermore, I give you permission to disagree with me. Not, again, that you need it. You don't need it. You can disagree with me whenever you want. But some of you have never actually been given permission by a pastor or a faith leader of any community to actually disagree. Diversity of opinion and thought are necessary in all spaces, but especially political spaces. Spaces where we're going to talk about solving a problem, we better not all come with the same idea, right? I don't, if I'm trying to solve a problem that exists in the world, the last thing I want is every single person to come to me with the same idea. We need a diversity of ideas of how we're going to solve this problem. Because it's not going to get solved if we just keep doing the same thing we've always been doing, or if we all go the same exact direction. We're probably going to need a few different thinkers. When you look at history and you look at really complex problems that get solved, they usually get solved by someone thinking outside of the box, going away from the majority thought. So it's okay to disagree with me. It's okay to think differently than me. And to be honest, this series, I'm not making a whole lot of bold, declarative, political statements. That's actually not the purpose of this series. The purpose of this series is to make some more general statements that allow you to then take that back and consider and ponder on it. So right out the gate, I am going to make a controversial statement, though. Some would call it a controversial statement. I actually think it's a historically founded, obvious statement, but some would consider this next thing controversial. Here it is. Jesus was political. Jesus was political. So just right out the gate, if you've ever had a pastor tell you, like, Jesus wasn't political. Jesus was political. From birth to death and just about everything in between, the life of Jesus was politically charged. Now, part of this is not even Jesus' doing. Part of it is just the setting that he falls into, okay? But the setting he falls into and how he responds to it, he is not passive. He's very much not passive when he's placed into this political system. He says things and does things that are meant to conjure a response from people who are in political power. And if you know anything about crucifixion, it's ultimately what leads to his death, is the politicalness of Jesus. Each week I'm going to come back to this statement because I think, honestly, this is something that some of us just need to sit with, that Jesus was political. And I'm going to take some time each week to defend this statement. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to take some time each week to defend this statement, and then I'm going to share the talking point for the week for us to consider. But we have to understand that the life of Jesus was politically charged. Just about every decision in his ministry had deep political consequences. And again, ultimately led to a political death. Crucifixion was for insurrectionists, a term we've become more familiar with in the last couple of years. Jesus was considered an insurrectionist by Rome. That's why people got crucified, as an example for that. What's interesting is that Jesus enters the power struggles of his day with a different approach, a very different approach than many others in his time. Now, to begin, to defend this statement that Jesus was political from birth to death, you're like, well, Jesus is a baby and he's being political? He's like, fight the power. No, from his birth, Jesus is dealing with political realities. People start calling Jesus the King of Kings as a baby. That's crazy. In that society, that's calling out the rulers of his day. So this is what happens, actually. This is the consequence of what happens. In Matthew 2, we see this. Joseph got up, took the child, Jesus, and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. Herod's trying to come kill all the children who look like Jesus, who were born around the time of Jesus, because he's like, who's this King of Kings that's trying to take my throne? I'll take him out. This is a political leader who's worried about his throne. Jesus wasn't political. Nothing about Jesus is political. What do you mean? Right out the gate, we're talking about a position of politics, king. Jesus, in him just existing, being the King of Kings, that being what is placed upon him, and threatening a political leader as a baby. That political leader being so concerned about a baby, let's just talk about that. You have to be a pretty insecure leader to be like, there was a baby born. Oh no, they're coming for me. And so Jesus, from a very young age, flees his homeland due to a ruler. He becomes a refugee. Another political statement we're familiar with, right? Jesus was a refugee. His homeland's occupied by Rome, and Rome, in this case, is threatening to kill him. So his father takes him out into Egypt for safety. From the beginning of the story of Jesus, we see politics interwoven in his story. You can't remove it. If you remove it, you remove details. Listen, can I tell you something? If you were a baby and you had to flee a country, your country of origin, for the purpose of your life being saved, you think that's going to affect you? You think that's going to change your trajectory of your life? You think that's going to change your story? You think that's going to inform how you respond to people? You think that's going to inform maybe how you treat refugees? Probably. Probably. You think that's going to inform how you interact with the marginalized when you've been marginalized and had to go live in a community that's not your own? Had to be othered in that way? You think that's going to inform how you treat people? Yes, Jesus is God, but also fully human. And in this particular case, we see this reality of Jesus' story. And then when we know how he responds to marginalized communities, you begin to say, well, how could he not respond with grace to that community? Imagine what it was like growing up in Egypt, being an outsider. Imagine what it was like fleeing for your life. The trauma that Mary and Joseph face, being teenagers, not even having their family around when they have Jesus, being likely excommunicated from their family, and then having to flee for their lives from violence. The social and political has already entered the story before Jesus is even born. I could change that statement to before Jesus' birth. It had already impacted his life. So, before we go into what we're going to talk about today, I found this great video. It's from the YouTube channel Invicta, and it's titled "How They Did It: Paying Taxes in Ancient Rome." And so here's the deal. You know this. Taxes is political. Taxes are mentioned all around the New Testament, and they're also mentioned a lot by Jesus. So we're going to watch this next video, and it's going to give you a little bit of information about the tax system of Jesus' day. So watch this.
In the early days of the Republic, when the city was small, Rome actually collected its own taxes. This was rather primitive, and these taxes were mostly levied as a percentage of an individual's wealth, as opposed to income that governments do nowadays. So the way they would have done this in the past is you would actually literally send someone out, and they would include measurements of someone's land, their homes, the real estate, slaves, animals, personal items, and monetary holdings. So you can imagine someone walking out there in the fields to a local estate and just counting up all these quantities and trying to make a rough assessment of just how much is this person worth in terms of their wealth, how much goods and monetary possessions do they have. And then they'd take this total valuation and they would use this to assess an individual's overall wealth, and then, tally this every 5 years as a part of a census. And then this data would then in turn be used to put someone into a certain property class. And this was actually built into the way Romans actually configured their military obligations, with the wealthiest being expected to supply, more equipment and armor and be in a certain class of the military system, whereas the more impoverished folks would probably have less stuff to their name. And you have this superimposed with wealth class and then also age groups, and that's eventually what forms kind of the basis of the development of the Roman legions. But anyways, that's an aside. So back to the taxes at hand here. So when they're collecting these taxes, rates would generally be fixed for the various classes and are estimated to have been around 1% under normal circumstances. However, in the case of an emergency, like a upcoming war or raid or something going on, taxes might be increased to around 3%, we calculate. And these are all kind of rough figures, but you get a sense of what's going on here. However, as Rome grew, it became harder and harder to properly assess wealth accurately, and then in turn collect taxes efficiently. In addition, conquests increasingly made up more and more of the state's revenue, reducing the need to focus on developing a proper state-managed system of taxation. In fact, by 167 BC, the Republic had so enriched itself through war that it no longer needed to levy a wealth tax on its Italian citizens. Though we have to admit that they still did pay some form of vectigalia, which were essentially duties on things like imports, exports, or the use of public land. So you can never really get away from paying taxes. In any case, with the tax burden shifting to the provinces and the small republic quickly transforming into a sprawling empire, a new, unique system of tax collection would emerge. What we find is that Rome's rapid rise to power in the Mediterranean quickly outpaced its ability to keep up administratively. When new provinces were added, their governance was usually granted to a consul or proconsul and their associated staff, which numbered no more than a dozen or maybe a couple dozen. Though such rule was theoretically unlimited, in reality and in all practicality, this small group of Roman officials had to rely quite heavily on local administrative institutions for support. When it came to collecting taxes, they also sought outside help. What developed was a system of tax farming, whereby the Roman government privatized its tax collection. The system worked as follows. First, Roman officials would estimate the approximate tax to be extracted from a region. Next, they would host an auction to give away the rights to collect this money on their behalf. This would be attended by publicani, or private contractors, who were actually involved in a lot of the Roman economy, but in this case we'll be dealing with their activities when it came to taxes. Here, at the auction, let's say for instance the government had said that they wanted to collect 1 million sesterces. What would happen is these publicani would come in with their company and said, hey, I will be able to collect 1.1 million sesterces. And then the next one would say 1.2 million, and eventually whoever basically had the highest bid, they would win the contract. And now what would happen is they would have the government backing to go ahead and collect those taxes. This was to a benefit to the Roman government in that basically it reduced their administrative burden and risks. And they could count on, setting a fixed amount of taxes and getting that for sure, despite, whatever economic fluctuations, they could expect to get that money up front. And so it made it very consistent and low risk. Now, the benefit for the publicani was that even if they may have won just a bid for, let's say 1.3 million sesterces, that 1.3 million sesterces that was in the hole, well, when they went to the provinces, they would be able to collect that and far more. So, because they had the backing of Roman authorities, they could call on legions, they could call on the help of local governors, and they could even pay thugs to collect the taxes at sword point. And so, yeah, maybe they, had to pay the government, but at the end of the day, they can maybe even collect 2 million or more sesterces and just line their pockets with tons of money. And the amount of money to be made here was surely a huge problem because it led to ridiculous amounts of corruption, exploitation, and oppression. Bribes would be paid to Roman administrators to ensure that they looked the other way, and you'd have all kinds of shenanigans. Such was the wealth of the provinces, especially in the east, that politicians would virtually bankrupt themselves to gain control of one, with the expectation that they would quickly recoup any losses with huge profits and become fabulously wealthy. Even Crassus, who was renowned for his wealth, found his own 200 million sesterces dwarfed by funds raised by his colleagues plundering the provinces. His rival Pompey, for instance, was said to have been able to buy and sell Crassus many times over with the silver and gold he had collected. This exploitation, however, did not go unchallenged. Heavy taxation at the hands of the publicani often pushed the population into unrest or revolt. Sometimes, excessive taxation was even regulated by the Romans, though this was less for altruistic reasons than the machinations of jealous politicians seeking to curb the money-gathering operations of their rivals.
All right, so that gives you a little bit of like a backstory and understanding of tax collecting. What they didn't touch on was what's really interesting is those, private contractors as they determine them, which is really an interesting term given our political realities. But the private contractors would often then go utilize locals who were from the region to then be the ones who go and do the tax collecting. And what I mean by that is imagine we have a superpower coming into our region, taking over, and then they come tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, we'll take care of you and your family. You'll actually be able to have a lot of money, but you just got to go exploit all your friends and family and other people because you know the region, you know where all the wealthy people are. And so if you just turn on your own people, then you know what? We got a job for you if you can just turn on your own people. And this made tax collectors very unpopular, as you can imagine, right? Like, I don't think we would want to be friends with these people, right? So Jesus begins calling disciples. He starts calling fishermen. He's like, I'm going to call these fishermen to follow me. And these fishermen begin to follow him. And then, as these fishermen are following him, this is what happens in Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. He looked at Matthew and he said, you know what? Follow me. Which, by the way, is a loaded statement. It's a statement that says you have what it takes to follow a rabbi, because in that culture it was very elite to follow a rabbi. It's actually a statement that he's making, that he's even allowing fishermen to follow him, because that is a statement of even people who are commoners can follow a rabbi. All right? But now he's looking at a tax collector and he's saying, follow me. And what does Matthew do? He gets up and he follows him. This is a political verse of the Bible because it is economic in nature. This is turning things upside down. There are consequences on two sides of this. Well, multiple sides of this. There are consequences for Jesus because he's disrupting the tax collecting. Like he's He's disrupting the contract that's been made for Matthew to go out and extort money from people. The person that is the chief tax collector here is going to have deep problems with this situation. We never really hear how Jesus gets out of that, but he disrupts this system. Matthew's in trouble because, let's be honest, you owe someone money because this person's been taking care of you to some extent, and you owe this person money. This is like a bookie situation. You know what I mean? Like you're about to come get your legs taken out, right? This is not good for Matthew either, but at the same time, there's this liberation, this political statement of liberation that's being made here. That if you don't understand the culture and the situation, you just say, oh, he was just a tax collector. That was just a thing back then. It was just like any other job. Just like they sat their nets down, he just left his tax collector booth. Did he take the money? Did he leave it? Did he go cash in with his chief tax collector before he left? These are important questions because it's going to lead to some different experiences potentially on the back end. No, what happens next, which we're not even going to go into today, what happens next is he throws a party and invites all of his tax collector friends, and Jesus says, y'all can follow me too. And this is a problem because then not even the tax collector do we hear from them, the chief tax collector or the people who would have had deep problems with that. But we hear from the Pharisees who are like, you're not supposed to be around these tax collectors. They're traitors. And Jesus is like, it's not the healthy you need a doctor. It's the sick. A political statement. Like, we think of this as simply a spiritual statement, but it's making a statement to how sick the culture was at the time, how sick even the politics were at the time. Like, they need liberated from this system that's oppressing them as they're going out and oppressing others. It's oppressing them too. They've bought into a system of power and privilege that is not good for their souls. I see them as sick and in need of a doctor, not just the people they're exploiting. Think about that. That's amazing when we actually understand it in context. Again, this is not partisan. This is not either or thinking. This is saying entering in with a whole new perspective than what was had at that time. Jesus challenges the politics of the day and the responsibilities that existed for this tax collector. And it's no wonder that later on Zacchaeus, when he meets with him, who's a tax collector, and he liberates Zacchaeus, he decides to have a meal with him, which is shocking that he would have a meal with Zacchaeus. The chief tax collector was Zacchaeus. You begin to wonder, was Zacchaeus in charge of Matthew? Did they have some type of relationship already? Was there something going on here already? Was there some way that Jesus maybe knew a little bit about Zacchaeus through Matthew? We don't get all these backstories, but there was probably a connection that Zacchaeus had to Jesus of some kind. And at some point, maybe over the years that he had lost Matthew and heard about Jesus, heard these mutterings about Jesus, he had realized that really the person who was liberated in that was Matthew. Matthew was liberated from tax collecting. And he's like, maybe I could get that same liberation. And he does. Story of Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus makes a political decision too, not because Jesus tells him to, but he says, I'm going to give my wealth away. I'm going to pay back to the people that I oppressed. Again, a political story. Because this is economics. You're going to go back and give to these people that you've exploited? It's all through the scriptures. You can't argue that it's not. Jesus is constantly stirring up political divisions. Many churches and pastors will tell you Jesus wasn't political and he never asked you to be political. And I always say, well, what do you consider political? Because by all historical accounts, talk to any historian and they're going to say Jesus was incredibly political. Now, the conclusions are not one for one. And this is where I think we make the mistake. Jesus was political, so however I'm political, he must be political like I'm political because that's how it works, right? I'm right. Of course I'm right. My view on the world's right. But the difference is, first of all, you're probably wrong. But second of all, the other reality, and that's me too, I'm probably wrong. But the other example and reality is that Jesus was living in such a different context than us. What we often try to do is these one-for-one transfers from the life of Jesus to our reality. And what's interesting is Jesus didn't get a vote. It's not like Jesus was advocating for people to go in the voting booth and change their circumstance. They didn't have that option. Jesus did not live in a democracy. Jesus lived in a region occupied by a violent foreign entity. This is not our circumstance. So to try to take things one for one from that is a challenge. We have to do some interpretation. We have to do some understanding. What is Jesus trying to get to at the root here? And then how do we best apply the principle to our lives? It's probably not going to be the same for everyone. That's the warning, right? Is that when we come away with the conclusion that the way I'm doing it is the way it needs to be transferred to everyone. The politics of Jesus do not always perfectly transfer to us in our time, in our context. But what we can do is do our best to try to find the principle, or the talking point, if you will. Now, talking points are usually what a partisan political group, do when they are dealing with a particular issue or problem and they want to get everyone on the same page. They all get in a room or they send a memo. Hey, when this comes up, we're going to say X, Y, and Z. When you're on screen, this is what you're going to say. And then what ends up happening is when the cameras turn on, we stay on message. We know the talking points. For this series, the talking points are not something for the cameras, the headlines. The talking points are for us in our spirit. And what I want to talk about is the talking points that we need to remind ourselves that I think Jesus would be telling us, not the headlines, but what Jesus would be telling us if he were here. Now, believe it or not, Jesus actually talks again about taxes later on. You've maybe even heard this portion of Jesus' teachings, but he seems to constantly be dealing with tax collectors and taxes all throughout his ministry because, believe it or not, 2,000 years ago, they were dealing with some of the same problems as we deal with now, right? So here's what happens in Mark 12, which will lead to our kind of talking point for this week. All right. Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. So right off the bat, I just want to tell you, this is political. These groups are trying to remove the power of Jesus. And I'm not saying that in a spiritual sense. I'm saying he has influence. He enters into a town, people be coming out to see him. He's got a big crowd. And they're like, no. We get the crowds. How do we trap this guy, make him say something stupid so that we can cancel him? That's what they're trying to do. This is a political thing. This is the politics of power and influence. The Pharisees and the Herodians come, they're trying to trap Jesus. They came to him and they said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity." Whenever you want to trap someone, always say something like that at the start. It's kind of like the way you say not to offend you, but okay, here's the deal. Whenever you say something like that, I know what's coming is going to be very offensive. Hey teacher, we know that you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. And in essence, hey, you treat everyone the same. You're all about equality. But you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Yes. Say all these kind of things about him. Now, we're going to trap him. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? What are we going to do? There are two sides, binary thinking going on at this particular time. It's an either or. Do we pay? Do we not pay? Okay? What are we going to do? How are we going to participate with this Roman occupation? Do we pay with a desire that ultimately our circumstance is minimized? We're able to just live our life in some type of peace with Rome. Even though they're occupying, we're trying to minimize the conflict. We'll pay what we got to pay. We'll be extorted, but we're still alive. We're still able to raise our families to some extent. We're still able to just keep breathing. Or do we revolt? I ain't paying no taxes. You ain't going to get those from me. You're going to have to kill me. Bring the sword. These were the circumstances in Rome. You can go read all about the daggermen in Rome who were revolutionaries revolting against Rome, who would go with these small little daggers into large crowds and kill Roman soldiers, primarily because of taxes. It's a very fascinating thing to understand the conversations that are happening in this day, this either or binary thinking. It's either A or B. But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought him the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is on this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. So fascinating right off the bat here, Jesus doesn't give an answer. Whenever Jesus is asked a question, he rarely gives an answer. He usually goes off to the side in some particular way. So he's doing this thing of hey, bring me a coin, let me look at it. Whose face is on it? What's it say on it? Okay, that's the inscription of Rome, okay? Then he says this. Then Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed at him because he didn't pick a side. Now, this isn't to say Jesus doesn't choose a side. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he does choose sides. But in this particular case, he knows he's not for violent revolution, but he's also not for people being oppressed and taken advantage of. So what he does is instead he removes the power from the thing that they've given so much power to. They've given so much power to this little coin. And he says, just give it back. Don't give that thing power. Even in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, God will take care of you. Look at how God takes care of the birds and the fields and the flowers. God will take care of you. There's this picture here that Jesus is saying you're giving way too much power to this conversation. You're giving way too much energy to this particular either or conversation. They were entered into these echo chambers of we either need to violently revolt against Rome because we're never paying taxes to these people, or we need to placate them by paying taxes to them. We need to try to find as much peace as we can with them, and part of that is that we need to pay them. Here's my point for the day. Here's the talking point for you, for me, for all of us. Following Jesus should push us out of our echo chambers. Jesus is always pushing people out of their echo chambers. The disciples are constantly being like, oh, okay, that changes things. Like, I wasn't thinking that, okay. Like, very first, hey, we're going to go into Samaria. No, Jesus, we don't go to Samaria. That's not what we do. We're not allowed to go there. Also, we've never seen a Samaritan. We've never been to Samaria. When we have seen Samaritans, they come to us, and we don't like Samaritans. We don't want to go to Samaria. Jesus, we're going. You can come or not. Let's go. They come into Samaria. Okay, I'm going to sit at this well. I could go into town with you, but you know what? Seems like you guys need more interactions with Samaritans. So go on in there and have fun. Like, this is how Jesus interacts with the disciples. He's constantly pushing them out of their comfort zones, out of their either or thinking into something new and expansive. If you want to be comfortable, get in an echo chamber and stay there and lock the door. That's so comfortable. It's so comfortable to have whatever you already believe confirmed, and never challenged to reconsider your position. But that's not the way of Jesus. To be clear, an echo chamber is an environment where a person only encounters information or opinions that reflect and reinforce their own. That is an echo chamber. And the problem with Jesus was echo chambers at the time of Jesus. He comes in and he breaks these echo chambers apart. He keeps forcing people to think again. So let's just talk about some of the modern day echo chambers we have, okay? This is where you might get angry, so let's do this, all right? Here's a modern day echo chamber we have, the news. The echo chamber of the news. Now this, agree with it or don't agree with it, is a scale. This is probably one of the most popular scales that I could find that was pretty, for the most part, like agreed upon. No one's ever going to agree upon anything when it comes to the news, but here we are. More reliable, less reliable, left, right. Now, let's say I find myself on this and I'm like, oh man, when I take the news in, I'm always right there. Well, maybe I should hear what they're saying right there, because I should probably try to understand what's outside of my particular echo chamber. I should probably recognize the echo chamber I'm in and try to hear what's being said in the inverse. That doesn't mean I have to agree with it, but it does mean maybe there's value in the understanding, attempting to see the world through the lens of someone different. Let's talk about this next one. The echo chamber of social media. Oh man, this one's bad. You want to talk to someone really good who knows a lot about this? Jameson. If you guys know Jameson, talk to Jameson. Jameson knows a lot about this because he works in tech and he works in AI especially. And the thing is, the algorithms that exist in the social media world exist with the purpose of triggering you to either go back to your echo chamber or to say something to you that deepens you further into your echo chamber, because when you're in your echo chamber, you get super emotional. Or when you get pushed in a way that like confirms what you already know, you get super emotional. Have you ever been looking at your screen and just want to throw your phone? Yes, Facebook did that to you. How dare they? No, but like when we get emotional, what ends up happening is we stay on the screen. And guess what happens when we stay on the screen? More ads, right? So this loop that's created is created in order to reinforce. I mean, they have neurologists that work for them for this particular purpose. I'm not trying to like vilify Facebook. We have a Facebook page. I advertised it earlier in the announcements. But what I'm trying to say is at least know that when you go on Facebook, it is built to be an echo chamber. That's the purpose of it. And it's only built to show you contrary information when it can ultimately trigger you to make you blast the comments. And then you're further engaged, further defending your particular part of the echo chamber. This is why the comment section is a dumpster fire half the time of anything that's even remotely controversial. I don't even comment anymore. I will post something benign and someone will say something stupid in the comments and I'll be like, not even worth a response. And someone will message me and be like, are you going to respond to them? I'm like, no, I don't have time for this anymore. I'm not going to enter into that. If they want to message me, maybe I'll have a conversation directly with them. But like I've learned, this is all a system forcing us further into these silos. And then when we talk about politics, breaking the echo chamber of partisan politics. Each side has their own talking points, their own way of seeing the world. And if I don't see it exactly like them, then I'm not part of that party. Or if I don't, like, this isn't the way we're designed to be as people. You can have some views that align with one party and some views that align with another party. You can have all kinds of, but why do we so attach ourselves to the echo chambers of one or the other? And part of it is because we love being in a tribe. We love having a group of people that are like-minded, and we need that. But if we're going to sacrifice the ability to reconsider our positions for that purpose, I would say that's too much of a sacrifice. So, again, following Jesus should push us out of our echo chambers. And there are a few echo chambers we deeply need freedom from, okay? Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that you can't have firmly held opinions, beliefs, or convictions. Because some of you right now are being like, yeah, I'll break out of my echo chamber, but here's the deal, Justin. Like, I know what's right and wrong. And yes, you do. I get it. There are things that are happening in our world that are wrong. And that's not because your echo chamber is telling you they're wrong. They are just wrong. But avoiding an echo chamber doesn't mean that you give equal consideration to these things, to all things. It simply means you're trying to understand how people have come to a contrary conclusion. Leaving your echo chamber can actually give you a deeper sense of conviction to the firmly held beliefs you already hold. When you go here, like, I'm just gonna be honest, okay? I am anti-slavery. Shocking, right? And today, no, I'm just kidding. Like I don't know of a pro-slavery movement. It's probably, who knows? But at the same time, I'm anti-slavery. I don't need to go give equal consideration to pro-slavery. I know where I stand on this. But if there was a movement like that to start, to understand it is only going to further deepen my conviction for what I already hold, which is that I'm against that, the ownership of people. Of course I would be against that. So getting a new approach to the binary way of thinking or the either or way of thinking, or maybe we might enter into that and say, you know what? I better understand my side. And I'm even more firmly deeper rooted in my side. Or we enter into it and we're like, wow, I'm glad I broke out of my echo chamber because there's actually some good points on that side. I think I'm more in the middle on this now. I mean, I definitely see the value over here of this, but I didn't consider how this decision and solving this problem that way would affect these people. I just am not in relationship with a whole lot of those people. So I didn't really get to understand how they would experience that particular change. When we try to think more analytically and less emotionally, we tend to expand some understanding here. Learning to think again is probably the best way we can leave our echo chamber. And so every week, I'm going to give you a very practical follow-up resource, okay? This book right here by Adam Grant, Think Again. Cannot recommend this book enough. I read this book about 6 months ago, and I think it's what we need right now. And this is just one particular quote from it. In a turbulent world, there's another set of cognitive skills that might matter more: the ability to rethink and unlearn. So many of us struggle to rethink and unlearn our already presupposed positions. Again, think about that. Rethink our presupposed positions does not mean we're saying we're going to leave it all together, right? We're just rethinking it. It might be that we rethink it, and in the rethinking of it, we're like further deeply rooted in that. It might be that in the rethinking, we like, oh, we learned that wrong. I need to unlearn something here. And that's a painful process because it requires a ton of humility. So for us today, we need to do the work to figure out what echo chambers we've built in our life. And here's the hard truth, and this is the part where you can get angry with me. You have an echo chamber. Don't compare yourself to someone else's echo chamber. Don't compare yourself to the uncle or the aunt or the friend or the whatever who literally like never leaves their particular wing of the internet, whatever, right? Compare yourself to yourself. You have some type of echo chamber, some type of group of people who are confirming everything, saying everything. It never challenges you. I just want you to think about this. If Jesus were here, he would make you uncomfortable. If Jesus were here, he would make you uncomfortable. So you should be seeking out ways to be uncomfortable in your politics, in the way you understand some of these problems being solved. And we're going to talk about, because I believe every one of these particular principles build on each other. So I just want to say, this isn't the end of this. This isn't like just leave your echo chamber. We're going to talk about when we leave our echo chamber, what we do. We're going to continue to build on this principle. But ultimately, when we leave our echo chamber, we become open to something new, to thinking again. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, as we leave our echo chambers, meet us in that place. Show us where we have echo chambers, where we've siloed ourselves off from other perspectives. God, we need to be people who consider others' perspectives. You might be looking at us right now, telling us that we're giving so much value to something that you're like, just give that back to Caesar. Why are you paying so much attention to that? Or we might be paying a lot of attention to something, but ultimately you want to deepen our commitment to it. You want us to have a growing, better understanding of it, but our echo chamber is keeping us from that. God, we pray that you would take these emotions, these passions that we have as we enter the problems of our world that we want to see solved. We want to see a more equitable, just, fair world. God, help us to break out of our echo chambers for the sake of unity. We will understand one another so much better when we break out of our echo chambers. It's not our job to force others to break out of their echo chambers, but it is our job to recognize our own echo chambers. To remind us what we are capable of, what we are responsible for. Give us the courage to do that. And in that place, meet us there, guide us, give us wisdom, give us compassion. Let us lead with love. In the name of Jesus, amen.